Hello. In the last part of this presentation, we're going to look at the process of actually constructing a CBT formulation. So what we want to do is take the information that we've gathered in the assessment and summarize it in a way that helps us to make sense of the nature of the problem, what might have led to the problem developing, and what keeps the problem going. So you should have watched the earlier chapters in this presentation before viewing this one. So in thinking about constructing a formulation, one important question is about timing. How long does it take to get to this point, and how much time should we spend on it? As so often, I think there's sometimes two competing tendencies here. Sometimes we feel a pressure to hurry on, to get through the assessment process as quickly as possible and get stuck into treatment. On the other hand, people sometimes feel an opposing pressure, feeling that they can't do an adequate formulation until they know every single thing that's ever happened to this person from the moment they were born up until yesterday. As usual, I think the answer lies somewhere between these extremes. And a plan that we've found works best for, particularly if you're a beginner at this kind of assessment and formulation, is to aim to do the assessment and formulation over 2 sessions. So the basic idea is that you spend the first session on gathering most of the information that you need. You then have time before the second session to go away and think about that, and perhaps to try out some ideas for what the formulation may look like. The huge advantage of this is that it gives you time to think about it, and that there's nothing like the process of trying to construct a formulation to make you realize what you don't know, the bits of information that you've forgotten to ask about, and so on. You may also be able to ask your client to do some useful homework between session 1 and session 2. So you can then go into session 2, ask any questions that you become aware of that you haven't asked before, pick up any information perhaps from any possible homework your client has done, and move towards constructing a formulation during the course of the second session, so that by the end of session 2 you have a formulation and at least a rough treatment plan. In making formulations, it's usually much better to use diagrams and look particularly for positive feedback loops or vicious circles, which are often very important parts of these kind of maintenance processes. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment. Last point about making formulations is that it's also important not to confuse effect with purpose. What I mean by this is that it's sometimes very tempting, very easy to jump to conclusions. For example, if my having agoraphobia means that my wife has to accompany me everywhere I go, to jump to the conclusion that I have my agoraphobia in order to make my wife accompany me everywhere I go. Now that by itself, without independent evidence, is an unwarranted conclusion. It might be true. There is such a thing as what people sometimes call secondary gain, but that's not universal, and it is not always the case that because something has a particular effect, there is even an unconscious intention to have that effect. So let's look at a basic model for formulations. Now, this is not supposed to be the only possible way of formulation. It's one possible model. If you get into this approach and you get more practiced at it, you may well develop your own way of drawing up formulations. So this is not supposed to be prescriptive, but it is at least one way of actually containing all of the important factors. So we have vulnerability factors, most commonly from early experience, but sometimes from later on, leading to the development of particular beliefs and assumptions. These, in conjunction with precipitating incidents or critical incidents, give rise to a problem which we describe in the 4 systems. And we also have the current triggers and modifiers that affect when that problem occurs and how bad it is when it does occur. And then perhaps most importantly for treatment planning purposes, we have one or more maintenance processes. Obviously the maintenance processes, there is no particular number for these, except perhaps it's worth saying that on the whole you don't want to have too many maintenance processes or it just gets confusing. So somewhere between 1 and perhaps 4 or 5 is fairly typical for the number of maintenance processes that are worth considering. And then from those maintenance processes we develop broad treatment targets, which, as we talked about in an earlier presentation, is essentially to disrupt those maintenance processes, because if we're right about the importance of those maintenance processes, disrupting them should allow the problem to dissipate. I just want to take you through a few common maintenance cycles. Again, important to be clear here that this is not supposed to be prescriptive. These are not the only maintenance cycles by a long way, nor is it necessarily the case that everybody has one of these cycles. They're just a few examples to illustrate the idea of how these kind of self-maintaining processes can occur. So let's begin with an example that's become very important in CBT for anxiety problems in particular, concept first developed by Paul Tsiolkovskis of so-called safety behaviors. Very simple but very powerful idea. The idea is that somebody has a fear of something bad happening. What that is may be enormously variable. That I'm going to have a heart attack, that I'm going to make a fool of myself, that I'm going to collapse. Lots of different fears. The crucial thing then is that people very often take steps to try and protect themselves from whatever it is they fear. And those steps are what we call safety behaviors. So safety behaviors means anything the person does which they believe protects them from their feared disaster. Note that all that matters here is what they believe. It doesn't matter whether there's anything realistic here. If they believe it serves to protect them, then it will have these effects. And the problematic effect is that with safety behaviors, nothing can ever disconfirm the threat beliefs. Because when I don't die of a heart attack, or I don't collapse, or I don't make a fool of myself, instead of thinking, oh, well, that shows I don't need to worry about it, what I tend to do instead is to think, phew, that was a close one. I was only saved by my safety behavior. Therefore, the threat beliefs are maintained, and we have a self-maintaining cycle. Let's give an example of this. For example, if I'm claustrophobic and I worry that I'm going to suffocate, then it may be that I take great care always to stay by an open door or an open window so that I can feel confident that I'm going to get enough oxygen and I don't faint or suffocate. The problem with this, as I was just saying, is that then when I don't faint or suffocate, I tend to think it was staying by an open door that protected me, not the fact that actually I don't need to worry about this. There's lots of stories that therapists tell to illustrate this kind of idea, one of which is about a man who's walking down the street when he sees a friend of his standing in the street, flapping his arms up and down like this. And he says to his friend, "What are you doing?" And his friend says, "I'm keeping the dragons away." He says, "But there aren't any dragons around here." To which his friend says, "See, that's how well it works." And you can use this kind of story to illustrate to clients that perhaps they're in a similar position to this guy in keeping away what are actually non-existent dragons. And it can also be useful to ask them, how would this guy learn that actually there are no such things as dragons? And most clients can fairly easily see that what this chap needs to do is to stop flapping his arms up and down, and then he would find that there still weren't any dragons. Another common maintenance cycle that's as common perhaps in depression as safety behaviors are in anxiety is reduction of activity, where depressed mood leads obviously to negative thoughts, and particularly to negative thoughts about activity, that it's not going to be enjoyable or it's too much hard work, etc. People therefore reduce their levels of activity, stop going out, social withdrawal is very common, may stop all kinds of other activities. And the problem with this is that it leads to a loss of most of the things that used to give them positive rewards. So without activity, we don't get any pleasure, we don't get any sense of achievement or success, and therefore that reinforces the depressed mood. And again, we have a self-sustaining cycle that just goes round and round. Catastrophic misinterpretation. Bit of a mouthful, but another common maintaining cycle where somebody fears that physiological symptoms, typically the symptoms of anxiety, they misinterpret those as indicating that something terrible is about to happen. So this pounding heart and tight chest and so on, instead of just meaning I'm anxious, this means I'm about to have a heart attack. Or my racing thoughts and my blurred vision and my sense of feeling a bit distant from things, again, doesn't just mean I'm anxious, it means I'm about to go crazy and lose control. Now, naturally enough, if one thinks of that kind of meaning, of course, it tends to make you more anxious. If you genuinely believe that you're about to have a heart attack, it's perfectly natural to feel anxious about that. So those misinterpretations cause further anxiety, hence even more symptoms, and again, we have a self-maintaining cycle. Scanning, or sometimes called hypervigilance. This occurs in different forms in different disorders. In a slightly different form, it may also occur in PTSD, for example. But here, I'm going to use the example of somebody who worries about a particular illness. So somebody thinks that they either have or are likely to develop some kind of serious or life-threatening illness. Naturally enough, one of the things that people often do if they have that kind of worry is scan or check themselves for signs of what they believe are the symptoms of that illness. Again, like the other examples, it doesn't matter whether they're right about whether those are the symptoms. All that matters is that they look for the symptoms they believe are the signs of the illness. And the problem with this kind of scanning is that what often happens is that if you start looking hard enough, you can always find what are actually perfectly ordinarily bodily sensations that normally we don't notice. But if you start scanning and checking for them, you will almost certainly find some such symptoms, which then people tend to interpret as meaning, oh my God, yes, there is something wrong with me. And again, we have a self-maintaining cycle. The bit here about the sensations being noticed or produced is that sometimes people may scan or check themselves in ways that inadvertently actually produce the symptoms that they're worried about. So, for example, I had a client who was worried that any kind of lump or bump on her body would mean that she was developing some kind of tumor. In an attempt to check herself for these signs, she would very frequently prod herself to see if she could feel any lumps or bumps. And of course, one of the results of prodding yourself several dozen or 100 times a day is that you start to develop lumps and bumps. Not tumorous ones, but nevertheless ones that she could then easily interpret as meaning there was something desperately wrong. The last example I'm going to give you is about so-called self-fulfilling prophecies. These often involve some kind of interaction with other people, negative beliefs about other people. For example, in this case, that other people are not going to like me. That kind of belief may then lead to me behaving differently towards them. For example, if I believe that nobody's going to like me, then I may refuse social invitations, for example. If people say, are you coming for a drink after work? Oh, no, I don't think so. The problem with that is that if I keep that up for long enough, my changed behavior may actually elicit behavior from other people consistent with what I fear. So that, for example, if I constantly refuse social invitations, it may well be that eventually the people at work stop inviting me. And when they stop inviting me, of course, that proves that I was right. People don't like me, and again, we have a self-sustaining cycle. Let's look then at how we put this together to constructing a formulation with a client. First of all, we want to work as collaboratively as possible. You don't want to be producing a beautifully, fully worked out formulation like a rabbit out of a hat, but rather work together with your client to develop a formulation that makes sense to both of you. People have different ways of doing this. As I was saying earlier, it often involves drawing diagrams, and you can do that on paper, which has some advantages in that it's, for example, easily copyable, so that you can give a copy to your client whilst keeping one yourself. Or you could do it on a whiteboard. Lots of CBT therapists have a whiteboard in their office, which has the advantage that you can both interact to work collaboratively on it, perhaps a bit easier, but obviously the disadvantage is that you can't easily copy it. If you run into an area where the client strongly disagrees with some part of the formulation, then our usual practice would be to go along with their view, at least initially. Don't insist that you're right, but be willing to work on the basis that their view is correct, because if in fact you're right and the formulation is missing some important part, that will become apparent during treatment, and you can go back and reconsider that disagreement. And similarly, we would not normally censor any part of the formulation unless there was something that you felt at this early stage in the relationship might threaten the development of a therapeutic relationship. For example, I guess it could be the case that if you thought there was some grounds for believing that secondary gain was an important part of the formulation, it might not be a good idea to put that into the formulation right at the beginning, because your client may take offense at it. But that would be very unusual. Most of the time, if we think something's important in the formulation, then it goes in there and we discuss it with the client. Let's look at part of the second interview with Lucy, where we're developing together the formulation. Lucy, what I'd like to do now is just try and kind of bring together the information that we've talked about so far to try and make sense of it in a way that will help us to understand what's happened to you, and so that we can start thinking about what we might need to do in terms of therapy. Okay. So I've got some ideas as we talk through this, but it would also be really helpful if you could give me your views as we go along with this, so that we end up with something that makes sense to both of us. Okay. What I want to end up with is what we call in CBT a formulation, just a kind of brief way of trying to condense some of the information and make sense of it.
Okay.
Okay. It'd be easier to see what that means as we go along. So what we would usually do is start at the earliest point with what we sometimes call vulnerability factors. What that means is things in your background that may have made it possible for you to develop a problem. They don't necessarily by themselves cause a problem, but they kind of provide the ground in which a problem may sprout. Yeah. Now, from what we were talking about earlier, do you have any ideas about what you think may have been important in your background?
Well, I think always being compared to my sister is probably something that's coming to mind. Yeah.
I agree. That would seem to me to make sense. So the constant kind of comparisons to your sister.
Yeah.
And I mean, clearly not favourable comparisons there,
No.
but the idea was always that you were somehow not quite as good
Yeah.
as her. Yeah. Is there anything else that you think was important in terms of background?
Well, I think the fact that both my parents seem to believe that.
Yes.
I mean, my teachers, kind of viewed me differently, but my parents, still
Right.
believe it to be different. And
So it seems important that that was not just school, but parents
Yeah.
as well.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, no one said anything otherwise, and yeah.
So, what do you think were the kind of ideas about yourself that developed from those experiences?
I think I can still hear my mum's voice saying, it's okay to be average. I think, I'm not even doing a very good job being me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, well,
That's a very kind of pointed way of putting it. I'm not even good at being me.
yeah,
Is that right? Is that capture something?
yeah. I think
Right.
that's what I'm usually thinking about myself.
And I suppose I'm also wondering, is there something about not just that I'm not as good as Samantha, but I'm not as good as most people?
Yeah, I mean, when I was at school, I wasn't the top of the class.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't at the bottom of the class, but I wasn't at the top,
Right.
which is where Samantha always was. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, so I wasn't, any better than my friends or
Mm-hmm.
my classmates,
Mm-hmm.
and I haven't done anything extraordinary with my life. So
And that matters. Because, I guess some people might say, I'm fairly average and that's okay, but it sounds as if clearly you're feeling that that's not okay.
well, I mean, I guess I think that because I can't really be as good as I can be, I guess I'm not really. I guess I'm afraid that people are just going to think that I'm. I mean, they're just going to notice, and it's just so obvious. They're just going to think that I'm incompetent, and
Okay.
they're going to pick up on that.
Okay.
So yeah, so I guess
So-
I am thinking about sort of whether I'm any good at things and whether I'm.
So something along the lines of people will notice or realise that I'm incompetent.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Good.
And I'm not saying I'm stupid, but it does go through my mind sometimes. But
Yeah.
I know I'm not stupid, but I don't think I'm particularly clever either. So
Yeah. And it sounds like, as often happens with this kind of thing, that although those beliefs about yourself may have been there for a long time, that they didn't cause major problems until relatively recently, until the last couple of years. Is that right?
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, as I say, I was pretty okay at my job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So the other thing that we need to think about then in terms of our formulation is, what is it that turned that from something that you could more or less comfortably live with to something that became a problem? And it seems pretty clear that from what you're saying that what made that difference was that period when you were having difficulties with your boyfriend
Yeah.
and then started to have difficulties at work as well.
yeah, and that year was pretty difficult. It was pretty horrendous.
Yeah, yeah. So we call those precipitants or critical incidents sometimes, the things that happened that actually began the development of a problem.
Mm.
And it sounds as if that's clearly the difficult relationship with your boyfriend, and at almost the same time the difficulties that you were having at work
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these beliefs then in combination with those incidents with the boyfriend and work led to the start of this anxiety and
Yeah.
panic. And then we want to just kind of briefly describe the kind of things that happen there, and that's, you've talked about your heart rate,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
most important to you, feeling sweaty.
Yeah. I guess, and hot as well, but
Yes, yes. And also your tense shoulders.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can really feel that.
And then lots of thoughts about other people are going to notice how I am, and they will think that I'm weird,
Yeah.
or maybe even mad
Yeah.
because of that.
Yeah.
So thoughts about what other people are going to think of me.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I think you said also that there were some thoughts, at least sometimes, that you might actually collapse.
Yeah.
But not that everything terrible would happen to you, not that you would die or anything like that, but that you
No.
would collapse and attract attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of what I don't want to happen.
Yeah.
So collapsing would not help.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. And that makes you feel very anxious,
Yeah.
panicky.
Yeah, I start to feel really, really anxious, and I know that it's just going to make it worse. But I mean, I just
Yeah. Absolutely. And also in the past there's been some low mood, but I think you said that that's not so bad at the moment.
yeah. I mean, when I moved home, and sort of was back with my parents, then yeah, I guess it was the end of that
Yeah.
relationship, and
Yeah.
things were a lot better.
And then the last part of this that we want to think about is what you actually do when you have the problem. And it sounds like there's several things there that we might want to talk about in a bit more detail later on, but there are things like avoiding going into certain situations,
Yep.
particularly social situations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Um,
Tesco's if I can avoid it.
yes. You wear black a lot
Yeah.
of the time in the hope that will hide any sweatiness. You said you carry around a paper bag,
Yeah,
although you've never actually used it.
yeah, yeah. Sometimes,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure why, but it just sometimes I think, well, better safe than sorry. What if I needed it?
Mhm. Okay. I think those are the main things that we talked about in terms of what the problems make you do. Yeah? And then there are the things that make a difference to this, what we call the triggers, the things that actually make the problem occur.
Right.
Yeah? So that's things like particular places like Tesco.
Yeah. Cues.
Queues, okay. I don't think you mentioned that earlier, but yes, okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, thinking about the worst of Tesco's
Yeah.
is definitely the queue.
Being stuck in a queue.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then there are things that make a difference to how bad the problem is, which includes things like the kind of people they are between strangers and friends.
Right. Yeah.
I think you mentioned that the temperature would make a difference, that a hot
Yeah.
place is
Yeah.
worse than a cooler one. Just remind myself. Do you remember what else did you mention that makes a difference? Oh, how busy you are.
Yeah.
You mentioned.
Yeah. If I'm under
Yeah.
pressure, if I have to, if I have to actually do something, then it's important. Then I feel a bit more anxious about it, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah. Okay. So all of these things feed in and make a difference to how bad the problem is.
okay.
Yeah. Does that make sense, do you think, so far, as a kind of description of what we've talked about?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's
Yeah.
kind of funny to see it put like that.
Uh-huh.
To sort of see it organised.
Yeah. Funny in a good way or funny in a bad way? Is that difficult in some way?
It's different. It's probably funny in a good way.
Okay. Now, the last part that I want to look at here is, I mean, in some ways is actually the most important part, which is to try and understand what keeps this problem going, because, I'm sure that like everybody else who has this kind of problem, that you've tried your damnedest to get better, to make it go away and so on, but clearly from the fact that you're here, you haven't so far succeeded in doing that.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is think about what we sometimes call maintaining cycles. In other words, the processes that might be going on that actually stop you from getting rid of the problem.
Right, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Now, again, I'd be interested to hear your ideas about this, but it seems to me there are at least 2 or 3 things that we might think about there. Do you, before I say any more, do you have any ideas about what you think keeps you stuck in this problem?
Well, I guess I just think I just get so out of control and just, like, it feels like it's not in my control. I just feel anxious and it just gets worse because I'm worrying about how anxious I feel. So.
Okay. So that makes sense, doesn't it? So you start to get anxious.
Yeah.
And you start to then have worrying thoughts about that I'm out of control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pass out and people are gonna think nasty things about me.
Yeah. So I'm out of control, I'm going to pass out, and so on. And I mean, I don't know about you, it seems to me quite natural that if I was thinking I'm out of control or I'm going to pass out, those thoughts would make me anxious.
Yeah.
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 So we have a complete kind of
Yeah.
vicious circle, that the anxiety makes you feel out of control, makes you think that bad things are going to happen, and that causes more anxiety, which makes you feel even more out of control, and so it goes round.
Yeah.
Does that make sense as a cycle that would tend to keep this thing going?
Yeah, and it's just so stupid, and I mean, I just can't. I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how to make it not, vicious.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can talk more about that later, but I guess, I mean, in brief, what would be needed to make it not vicious is to break this circle in some way, and in particular, perhaps think about changing the way you think about the anxiety, that instead of thinking this means I'm going to pass out or I'm out of control, that you might, I'm not saying this will seem easy at the moment, but you might be able to move towards a different way of thinking about it that would be less anxiety provoking.
That would be good.
Okay. So that's one of these kind of maintaining processes.
Yeah.
Another one, I think, is probably, again, very common in people with anxiety, which is simply avoidance. Yeah.
Right.
Now, as I say, it's very common, probably almost universal, that if we're anxious about something, we may feel an urge to avoid it. If you're frightened of dogs or spiders or whatever it may be, then you try and stay away from dogs or spiders. What's the problem with that? Why is that sometimes not a good long-term strategy?
Well, I mean, I quit my job, so I guess I was pretty good at my job, and I didn't have that sort of, I don't know. I guess I was busy. I was doing things. I didn't have time to sort of think about these
that
things.
applies to your job, but what about, for example, avoiding going to social occasions or going to supermarkets? Why do you think those may be not helpful in the long run?
Well, I guess if I don't go, then I'm missing out on a lot of life, and I guess I'm probably going to feel a lot more anxious the next time I go.
But I think that it's that last part that I think, at least for this purpose, is probably the most important. Yes, which is that avoiding things makes us feel better in the short run. It's easier to not go to the supermarket than it is to go. But often the problem is that in the long run, it actually keeps the anxiety going. And it does so often for several different reasons. So, for example, one problem with it may be that we simply don't learn any other way of dealing with those situations. You know, if you never go anymore to supermarkets or social occasions or whatever it may be, then you don't have any opportunity to learn to cope with that situation.
And I think I started dreading it.
Yeah.
I mean, I leave Tesco's and I think, oh, I did that, but I'm going to have to go again at some point.
Yeah. So that's one problem, is that it means that you don't get to learn ways of coping with these situations.
Okay.
Another problem with it may be in particular with the kind of thing that you're talking about. I think you mentioned that you often try and kind of shrink into the background, not look at people, look down at the floor and so on.
Yeah.
Now, another problem, I think, with that particular kind of avoidance may be that it's impossible for you to find out what they really think, because you're not paying any attention to them. You're looking at the floor or being very careful not to look at them. So, I mean, I remember fairly early on in our interview you said that you wear black to avoid sweating, but nobody had ever actually said anything to you about being sweaty.
No.
But one of the problems with this kind of avoidance of not looking at people and so on is that you may not have any chance to find out what they think, whether they think you're sweaty or weird or whether actually they think you're perfectly okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So you don't get any chance to get realistic feedback about what's really going on.
So I guess I do a pretty good job of sort of pretending otherwise.
Yeah. Okay. So again, we have another cycle that goes round and round where the anxiety makes you avoid something, which means that you don't learn to cope with it, or you don't get any realistic feedback about what's going on in that situation, which means that you stay anxious.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then I think that the other one that may be important here is about the other kind of ways that you're trying to keep yourself safe.
Yeah.
So we have things like the anxiety makes you do things like wearing black.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also carrying a paper bag.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the problem with these things is that they stop you from finding out whether your fears are real. Because, you know, when you don't, for example, attract any attention from sweating, you could decide that that means that actually I don't need to worry about this. But what you actually tend to do is think, I avoided it because I was wearing black.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it means that nothing can ever actually convince you that you don't have to worry, because whenever the disaster doesn't happen and people don't say, oh, what a weird person, and so on, you don't tend to think that's because it's actually all right. You tend to think it's because I was wearing black, or it's because I didn't attract any attention, or it's because I was carrying a paper bag.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that actually, as it were, protects the fears from any realistic idea of what's actually going to happen in those situations. So again, we have a vicious circle that keeps the anxiety going.
Yeah.
There's a story that people sometimes tell to illustrate this kind of idea, which is about a man who's walking down the street and he sees a friend standing on the street, and the friend's standing there flapping his arms up and down like this. And he says to him, what are you doing? He says, I'm keeping the dragons away. And his friend says, but there aren't any dragons around here. To which his friend says, see, that's how well it works. And these kind of behaviours may be a bit similar to that they're keeping away non-existent dragons.
Yeah.
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 Now, you know, if, I mean, obviously it's a silly story, but if something like that really happened, how could this guy learn that actually there aren't any dragons? What would he need to do to find out whether there really are any dragons?
Stop flapping.
Yeah. He'd need to stop flapping, and then he would find out that actually the dragons still don't come. And in the same way, it may be a very useful part of therapy to stop doing the things that you think keep you safe, so that you can find out that actually the bad things don't happen even without those.
It's quite scary.
Absolutely, and obviously, we'll need to talk more about that and plan it carefully at a pace that feels reasonably comfortable to you. Do those make sense in terms of what keeps the problem going?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought of the avoidance like that before. I mean, it makes me feel really stupid because I'm doing this to myself, really.
Well, I don't think it should make you feel stupid, because I think what we're actually saying here is that these are processes that all of us can get into at times. It's not something that's unique to you or even unique to everybody who has panic attacks, that they're absolutely normal processes that happen to all of us and may make it genuinely very difficult to get out of this kind of problem. As we were saying earlier, for example, everybody, if they're afraid of something, will tend to have some urge to avoid that thing. It's not just you, it's a very common reaction.
Okay.
And what this does is tell us something about where we need to be aiming treatment. Because in terms of treatment, what we want to do is break these vicious cycles that keep the problems going. So, as we said a few minutes ago, we want to perhaps change the way you think about what the anxiety means.
So thinking positively.
Not thinking positively, but thinking realistically. Thinking positively may be just as unrealistic as thinking negatively, because sometimes things aren't positive.
Right, yeah.
So what we want to aim to do in CBT is not try and get you to always think positively, but rather to try and help you find ways of thinking realistically about what's going on.
Yeah.
So as I say, perhaps change those thoughts, reduce the avoidance, so that you have a chance to actually learn what really happens in the situation and how you could cope with it. And reduce these, what we call safety behaviours, the equivalent of the man flapping his arms up and down, to reduce those so that you can find out whether actually there are any dragons or not.
Okay.
What do you think about that?
I mean, it sounds, I know this is what I need to be doing, so it's just a bit daunting to think about now, but yeah, I know I need to do it.
All right. So what we could do next then is start to think about more detailed plans about how we may try and put some of these ideas into operation.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's leave it there for the moment then. Thanks,
Okay.
Lucy.
Thank you.
So from our formulation, we can then derive, at least in broad terms, the targets for therapy. As we said before, essentially the targets will be to break the vicious circles that are maintaining the problems. So in the case of Lucy, to change her interpretation of her symptoms, to reduce her avoidance, and to drop or reverse her safety behaviours. Other presentations will give you more details about possible therapeutic strategies. So that completes the presentation on assessment and formulation. The next step is perhaps for you to go and try it out with 1 or 2 clients under supervision and see whether you can develop CBT formulations for your own clients.